The sound was the first violation. It was not the sound of my son's distress. His sound was a low, rhythmic, and intricate hum, a private melody he used to self-soothe a sound as familiar and comforting to me as the steady beat of my own heart. No, the sound that violated the golden peace of the late afternoon was the sharp, aggressive hiss of a high-pressure water nozzle. It was a sound of focused power, followed instantly by the percussive slapping impact of a hard jet of water hitting pavement, then grass, and then sickeningly flesh. Then came my son's shriek. It was a sound I had dedicated my life to preventing. It was not a cry of anger or a shout of childish petulance. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated sensory agony. It was the sound of 1,000 stinging needles of ice-cold water striking hypersensitive skin, the sound of a carefully constructed internal calm being violently, deliberately shattered. It was a sound that bypassed my ears and struck a primal vibrating chord deep in the marrow of my bones in the place where I was only and entirely a mother. I was out the back door before the screen had even finished slamming shut, my heart a frantic, panicked drum against the cage of my ribs. And there, in the warm, forgiving light of a perfect suburban afternoon, was a scene of such casual, breathtaking cruelty, it seemed to defy the very laws of nature. My 10-year-old son, Leo, was drenched, huddled in a tight ball on the grass of our own backyard, his hands clamped hard over his ears, his small body trembling uncontrollably. He had been in the middle of a sensory break, a necessary and quiet personal ritual he performed to decompress after the overwhelming social and sensory demands of a long day at school. And standing on the edge of our property line, a green garden hose gripped tightly in her white-knuckled hand, was our neighbor Brenda Miller. A look of grim, righteous satisfaction was etched onto her face like a death mask. The jet of water was still aimed directly at him, a relentless punishing stream. "Go cry somewhere else," she yelled, her voice shrill and piercing, rising over the hiss of the water. Her anger was a tangible thing, yet it seemed completely disconnected from the reality of the situation before her. "We don't need your little tantrums disturbing the peace and quiet of this neighborhood." "Brenda, stop!" I screamed, my voice a raw, ragged thing I barely recognized as my own. I didn't hesitate. I ran to Leo, positioning my own body as a shield between him and the onslaught. The cold spray soaked through my shirt in an instant, a shocking, icy slap. "What in God's name are you doing? He's a child!" She finally reluctantly lowered the nozzle, the water pressure dying with a resentful sputter. But the hard, unforgiving expression on her face did not soften. It remained a mask of unyielding judgment. "I am restoring order, Anya," she said, her voice dripping with a chilling clinical condescension. "Your son was making a scene as he so often does. Someone had to put a stop to it." I knelt on the wet grass beside Leo, my arms wrapping around his shivering, soaking wet body. He had retreated deep inside himself, a place where I couldn't reach him. The sensory assault had sent him into a full-blown neurological shutdown. He was nonverbal, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at nothing. His body was rocking back and forth in a frantic rhythm, his system desperately trying to find its way back to equilibrium. His quiet, self-soothing hum had been replaced by a terrifying, profound silence. I looked up at Brenda, at her sensible gardening clogs, planted firmly on her pristine lawn, at the self-satisfied fury etched on her face. And the part of me that was Dr. Anya Sharma, the county director for the Special Needs Education Program, the part of me that knew every line of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, every nuance of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and every legal protection afforded to a vulnerable child like mine, rose up like a tidal wave of cold, clear rage. She didn't see a child with a disability experiencing a painful neurological episode. She saw a tantrum. She saw a disturbance. She saw a problem that needed to be extinguished, to be washed away with force. She had no idea that she had just committed a felony assault on a member of a federally protected class. She had no idea that she had just declared war on a woman whose entire career, whose entire life's work, was dedicated to fighting the very brand of ignorant, vicious prejudice she so perfectly embodied. She thought she had restored order. In reality, she had just shattered her own world, and I would be the one to patiently and methodically pick up the pieces and hand them to the district attorney. Our life was a carefully curated symphony of routines, accommodations, and a profound, unconditional love. My professional life as the director of the county's special needs education program was a world of acronyms and relentless advocacy. I lived and breathed IEP's 504 plans and the legal mandate for FAPE, a free, appropriate public education for every child. My days were spent in sterile conference rooms, acting as a bridge between worlds. I calmed frustrated, terrified parents. I trained overwhelmed, under-resourced teachers. I fought with impassive school district lawyers for the resources, the therapies, and the simple accommodations that children with disabilities needed to not just survive in a world not built for them, but to thrive. It was a job that required a deep well of patience, a mastery of de-escalation, and an unshakable belief in the infinite potential of every child, no matter their diagnosis. But my most important, most sacred job began each day when I walked through my own front door. Being Leo's mother was the role that defined me, that gave my life its ultimate meaning. My late husband David, a brilliant astrophysicist who had seen the universe in numbers, had passed on his insatiable curiosity and his love of the cosmos to our son before cancer took him from us 5 years ago. Leo was autistic, and his mind was a universe of its own, a breathtakingly beautiful and complex place filled with spinning galaxies of facts about nebulae, the life cycle of stars, and the precise chemical composition of Jupiter's moons. His special interest was astronomy, and he could talk for hours with an infectious, unself-conscious joy about the subject, his knowledge both encyclopedic and profound. But his mind also processed the world through a different, more sensitive set of wires. The cacophony of a school hallway, the incessant flicker of fluorescent lights, the scratchy tag on a t-shirt, the unexpected change in a daily routine, these seemingly minor things could build up in his system, like static electricity, creating a painful charge that had to be released. His sensory breaks were not a choice. They were a biological necessity, as vital to his well-being as breathing. They were his way of resetting his overloaded nervous system, of finding his way back to a state of calm. Sometimes a break involved listening to the intricate patterns of a classical symphony on his noise-canceling headphones. Sometimes it was the deep, calming pressure of his weighted blanket. And sometimes, like on that afternoon, it was simply the act of sitting in the quiet of our own backyard, feeling the texture of the grass on his bare feet, and humming a low, steady, resonant tone, his own personal mantra, against the overwhelming chaos of the world. We had moved into the Oakwood Terrace community a year ago. On the surface, it was perfect, a quiet, family-friendly neighborhood with a top-rated school district. It was a place of manicured lawns, mature oak trees, and a powerful, if unofficial, social hierarchy enforced by the Homeowners Association. And the undisputed queen of that HOA, its most vocal, most feared, and most unyielding enforcer, was Brenda Miller. Brenda was a woman who had weaponized disappointment into a lifestyle. A retired real estate agent in her early 60s, she carried herself with an air of perpetual dissatisfaction, as if the entire world was a poorly staged open house that was constantly failing to meet her exacting standards. Her own lawn was a sterile, perfectly green carpet. Her flowers were arranged in militant, color-coded rows. She saw any deviation from this rigid order, a child's vibrant chalk drawing on the sidewalk, a neighbor's melodic wind chimes a misplaced garbage can, as a personal affront, a crack in the fragile foundation of her controlled world. The inciting incident, the first time her obsessive crusade for order targeted my son directly, had occurred a few weeks prior. Leo had been having a moment of pure, unadulterated joy in our front yard, after spotting a rare monarch butterfly a species he had been studying. He was flapping his hands, a common and entirely harmless form of physical stimming, a way of expressing an emotion too big for his body to contain. Brenda, who had been power walking past our house in a pristine tracksuit, stopped dead in her tracks, her face contorting into a mask of disgust and alarm. "Anya!" She had called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, piercing the quiet afternoon. "You need to control your child. That kind of behavior is disruptive. It's not appropriate for a public space." I had walked out to the porch, forcing a calm I did not feel. "He's on our own lawn, Brenda," I had replied, keeping my voice even and pleasant. "And he's just expressing his joy. It's not hurting anyone. He's autistic, and that's one of the ways he communicates his feelings." Brenda had scoffed, a small, ugly, dismissive sound. "That's no excuse for a lack of discipline," she retorted, her gaze sweeping over Leo, as if he were an unsightly weed in her perfect garden. "He needs to learn to control himself, or people in this neighborhood will think there's something wrong with him." There it was, the toxic, profoundly ignorant belief that his neurological reality was a behavioral choice, a simple lack of discipline. The cruel and arrogant assumption that he should suppress his authentic self, the very essence of who he was, just to make her, and people like her, more comfortable. I had tried to explain, to educate her about neurodiversity, but it was like talking to a brick wall. Her mind was a closed, locked room. Her judgment had been passed. Leo was a disruption. And in Brenda's tightly controlled world, disruptions needed to be eliminated. The hosing incident was not just a burst of anger from a cranky neighbor. It was a calculated act of attempted erasure. It was a violent physical manifestation of her demand that he go cry somewhere else, that he and his disability simply disappear from her sight. The immediate aftermath was a blur of controlled professional action, overlaying a maelstrom of raw maternal rage. My first and only priority was Leo. I got him inside, stripped off his cold, soaking wet clothes, and wrapped him in the warm, heavy comfort of his favorite weighted blanket. The sensory assault had sent him into a full-blown shutdown, a state that terrified me every time it happened. He was nonverbal, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at a fixed point on the wall. His small body was still trembling, not from cold, but from a neurological system that had been violently short-circuited. The humming had stopped. It was replaced by a terrifying, profound silence that felt louder than any scream. While I tended to my son, a part of my mind, the organized, methodical part, was already documenting, building a case. I had seen the assault. I was a credible, expert witness. The act itself, deliberately spraying a child with a known disability, was a clear and flagrant violation of multiple state and federal laws. I called 911, my voice a calm, precise instrument, despite the fury that was making my hands shake. I reported an assault in progress on a vulnerable, disabled child. I gave my name, my professional title, and my address. I gave a clear, concise, and damning description of the perpetrator and the event. The rising action, the counterattack, began before the police cruiser had even turned onto our street. Brenda, perhaps realizing the potential gravity of her actions, immediately launched a preemptive strike, a campaign of self-preservation. She started calling other neighbors, her voice a frantic, high-pitched performance of bewildered victimhood. I could hear snippets of her panicked conversations through my open living room window as I held my silent son. A complete and total meltdown. He was screaming and thrashing uncontrollably. I was honestly afraid he was going to hurt himself or someone else. I just used a little spray from the garden hose to try and snap him out of it, to calm him down. She was already spinning her web of lies. She was not the aggressor. She was the concerned neighbor, the would-be hero who had bravely intervened to help a child in distress. My son was not the victim. He was the out-of-control problem child, a danger to himself and others. It was a disgusting, manipulative, and dangerously effective narrative. The police arrived, and the situation escalated into a nightmarish Rashomon on our quiet suburban street. Brenda's performance intensified. She shed crocodile tears for the two young officers, telling them how frightened she had been for my poor troubled boy. A few of our neighbors' people who only saw Leo from a distance, and who had already been primed by Brenda's years of gossip and fear-mongering, came out of their houses and offered hesitant, damaging support for her version of events. "He does have loud tantrums sometimes," one of them offered meekly to the officers, her eyes avoiding mine. "We've all heard it." The first shocking incident had been the physical assault itself. The second was this immediate, insidious gaslighting campaign to reframe it, to twist the truth, to turn my son's trauma into a justification for her violence. They were trying to erase the facts in real time. Then came the official escalation, a breathtakingly cruel abuse of the HOA's institutional power. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived at our door. It was a formal notice of nuisance violation from the Oakwood Terrace Homeowners Association. The letter, its language cold and legalistic, had clearly been drafted by Brenda and rubber-stamped by the weak-willed, conflict-averse HOA board she controlled. It stated that our household was in violation of Community Bylaw 17.4, the clause prohibiting excessive noise and behavior that disturbs the peaceful enjoyment of the community. It claimed there had been multiple complaints from numerous residents about Leo's frequent and loud public outbursts. It imposed an initial fine of $200 and warned in no uncertain terms that if the behavior was not curtailed within 30 days, the board would be forced to seek legal action to have us removed from the community for breach of the HOA covenant. It was a staggering act of institutional cruelty. They were using the very assault she had perpetrated and my son's natural neurological reaction to it as the primary evidence against us. They were fining us for my son's pain. It was a clear, unambiguous attempt to deprive us of our right to live peacefully in our own home, a coordinated campaign of legal harassment designed to intimidate us into leaving. The bullying then took on an even more sinister personal dimension. Brenda began a campaign of overt surveillance. She would stand on her porch, her phone held up, its camera lens pointed directly at us whenever Leo was in our yard. She was filming him. She made sure we saw her doing it, a silent, constant act of intimidation. One afternoon, as I was helping Leo into our car to go to his weekly occupational therapy appointment, she walked to the edge of her driveway, a cruel, pitying smile on her face. "You should really think about keeping him inside more often, Anya," she said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet concern that was more menacing than any shout. "For his own safety, of course. You never know what kind of videos might end up on the internet these days. People can be so terribly judgmental about what they see as bad parenting." It was a threat, a clear, vile, and unambiguous threat of blackmail. She was threatening to publicly shame my vulnerable child, to expose his most difficult, private moments to the world in order to force us to hide him away from public view. She was trying to coerce us into becoming her willing accomplices in his segregation. She had assaulted him physically. She had attacked us legally. And now she was menacing us emotionally. But she had fundamentally, catastrophically misjudged her opponent. She thought she was fighting a tired, overwhelmed single mother who could be easily bullied into submission. She didn't realize she was fighting a director who had an army of lawyers, advocates, and expert witnesses on speed dial. She had started a war on my turf, on the sacred ground of disability rights and human dignity, and I was about to deploy my entire arsenal. To truly defeat an enemy, to dismantle their power, you must first understand the source of that power. Brenda's cruelty was so profound, so disproportionate to any perceived slight, that I knew it couldn't be born of simple intolerance or neighborhood crankiness alone. It felt pathological, a deeply rooted weed that had been growing for a long, long time. While the criminal and civil cases against her were moving forward through their slow, methodical processes, I felt a deep, professional need to understand the why. What kind of person turns a garden hose on a disabled child in his own backyard? What kind of pain, what kind of trauma creates that kind of monster? My investigation into Brenda Miller's past was quiet and discreet, conducted late at night after Leo was asleep, using professional contacts and the labyrinthine public record databases that I knew how to navigate better than most. I was looking for a crack in the pristine facade of her perfect, orderly life, a hint of the trauma I suspected must be lurking beneath the surface, like a geological fault line. I found it in a series of old digitized newspaper articles from a small forgotten town in the state's rural interior from 30 years ago. The articles detailed a local tragedy, a house fire, a single-family home burned to the ground in the middle of the night. There was one fatality. The victim was a 22-year-old man named Daniel Miller. He was Brenda's younger brother, her only sibling. The initial reports were straightforward, a tragic accident. But as I dug deeper into the local newspaper's archives, I found the follow-up pieces, the more in-depth human interest stories that painted a more complex and far more heartbreaking picture. Daniel had not just been a victim of the fire. He had been its unintentional cause. He had been a gifted, if troubled, local artist, a sculptor who worked with volatile resins and industrial chemicals in a poorly ventilated basement studio. The fire, according to the official report from the fire marshal, had been started by the accidental ignition of chemical fumes from a faulty space heater. But the most tragic detail, the one that made my breath catch in my throat and my heart ache with a sudden, unexpected empathy, was that Daniel had suffered from a severe, debilitating, and largely untreated bipolar disorder. According to interviews with his friends at the time, he had been in the midst of a deep, isolating depressive episode in the weeks leading up to the fire. He had stopped taking his medication, convinced it was dulling his artistic creativity. He had been isolating himself, working erratically, his behavior becoming increasingly unpredictable. His death, while officially ruled an accident, was shrouded in the thick, suffocating fog of his mental illness. Had it been a true accident, or had it been a form of passive suicide? A tragic consequence of his inability to care for himself in the dark, suffocating depths of his own mind. This was the midpoint twist. This was the secret history that laid the foundation for the woman Brenda had become. Her younger brother, her only sibling, had died in a fire caused by his own disruptive and unpredictable behavior. A behavior that was an inextricable manifestation of his invisible illness. The shame, the public humiliation, the private guilt, the unanswered questions, the rage at his illness. It must have been an overwhelming, unprocessable cataclysm of emotion for a young woman to endure. How does a person ever truly recover from a tragedy like that? The answer for Brenda was apparently through a lifetime of ferocious militant denial and an obsessive commitment to control. She couldn't control her brother's brain chemistry. She couldn't control the fire that had consumed him. So she had spent the rest of her adult life trying to control everything and everyone else. She built a fortress of perfect order around herself, a world of manicured lawns and rigid, unforgiving rules, a world where there were no unpredictable variables, no disruptive behaviors, no chaos. And then we arrived. A family that did not fit neatly into her ordered world. And my son Leo, a child whose neurological condition was also invisible to the naked eye, whose behaviors were also, to the untrained and unsympathetic observer, disruptive. In Leo, Brenda didn't just see a neighborhood nuisance who needed to be disciplined. She saw the ghost of her dead brother. She saw the humming, the stimming, the sensory breaks, and she was transported back 30 years. She saw the chaos that she believed had destroyed her family. Leo's neurological reality was not just an annoyance to her. It was a terrifying, visceral echo of the past, a blaring red flag signaling a loss of control that she would not tolerate a second time. Her cruelty was not random. It was a deeply ingrained pathological defense mechanism, a twisted form of hypervigilance. When she turned that garden hose on my son, she wasn't just trying to silence a child making a noise. In her deeply wounded, irrational mind, she was trying to extinguish a fire that had been burning inside of her for 3 decades. She was trying to wash away the ghost of her own unbearable, unacknowledged grief and guilt. This knowledge changed everything. It did not excuse her actions for a single second. What she did to Leo remained a monstrous, unforgivable assault. But it gave her a motive that was rooted in a tragedy so profound, it was almost Shakespearean. I now understood that I was not just fighting a neighborhood bully. I was fighting a woman haunted by a ghost, a woman who was reenacting a 30-year-old trauma on my 10-year-old son. And I knew with a chilling certainty that the final confrontation, the final act of this terrible drama, would not just be about legal statutes and HOA bylaws. It would be about forcing her to finally publicly face the ghost she had been running from her entire adult life. The emergency HOA meeting was Brenda's masterstroke, a piece of carefully orchestrated political theater designed for a single purpose: my family's public humiliation and eventual expulsion. She and her two allies on the board had called the meeting under the official guise of addressing the escalating pattern of disruptive incidents in the neighborhood. Her goal was to publicly brand my family as a dangerous nuisance and to use the carefully cultivated fear and prejudice of the room to force a vote on formally sanctioning us. This, I knew from my professional experience, would be the first legal step in a process to have us evicted from the community for breaching the HOA covenant. She had stacked the deck canvassing her supporters for weeks, feeding them her twisted narrative of Leo as a violent and unstable child, and me as his negligent and enabling mother. The community clubhouse, a sterile beige room with uncomfortable folding chairs, was packed to capacity. The air was thick with a palpable tension, and the cheap, bitter smell of burnt coffee from a communal urn. Brenda and the two other board members she controlled sat at a long table at the front of the room, a self-appointed tribunal of suburban jurisprudence. My small contingent of supporters, my lawyer friend Sarah, who had come to act as my legal counsel, a few other compassionate neighbors who had seen through Brenda's lies, and a highly respected child psychologist from a nearby town who had volunteered to speak as an expert witness on autism, were seated together near the front, a small, defiant island of reason in a sea of manufactured outrage. Brenda opened the meeting, her voice a carefully modulated performance of grave, sorrowful concern. She spoke of the community's fundamental right to peaceful enjoyment of their property, a right she claimed was being violated. She recounted a litany of complaints, all anonymous of course, about loud, disturbing noises at all hours, and erratic, unpredictable behavior emanating from our home. She then addressed the hosing incident, her voice dropping into a register of deep, feigned regret. She described it as a desperate last-ditch attempt by a concerned neighbor to de-escalate a dangerous situation before a child could harm himself. And then, her masterstroke of cruelty, she played a short, deceptively edited video she had taken on her phone of Leo having a difficult moment in our yard. The video, stripped of all context, showing only the raw image of a child in distress, was a brutal and effective piece of propaganda. This is not about a single child, or a single family, she concluded, her voice ringing with a false magnanimous authority. This is about the safety and well-being of our entire community. We must have rules, and we must enforce them, or we risk a decline that will affect all of our property values and our very quality of life. She had framed the argument perfectly for her audience. It was about rules, about safety, about money. She had made it easy for her supporters to vote with their wallets and their fears, rather than with their hearts or their heads. She called for a motion to begin legal proceedings to enforce the HOA covenant against my family. Before a hand could be raised, I stood up and walked to the single wobbly microphone that had been set up for residents. A hostile, expectant hush fell over the room. Brenda looked at me with an expression of triumphant pity. She expected an emotional outburst, a desperate, angry defense. She was about to be very, very disappointed. "Good evening." I began, my voice as calm and steady as if I were addressing a room full of school administrators in my professional capacity. My name is Dr. Anya Sharma, and while Mrs. Miller has framed this as an issue of community bylaws and property values, it is in fact an issue of federal and state law. I placed a thick, well-organized binder on the podium in front of me. My son Leo is autistic. This is a documented diagnosed neurological condition. Under the Fair Housing Act of 1968 and the Americans with Disabilities Act, he is a member of a federally protected class. Any action taken by this HOA or its board to sanction, fine, or remove my family based on behaviors that are a direct manifestation of his disability is an act of illegal housing discrimination. A nervous, uncertain murmur rippled through Brenda's supporters. This was a language they did not speak, a legal reality they had not considered. The incident with the hose. I continued, my voice hardening almost imperceptibly. Was not a de-escalation. It was a physical assault on a disabled child. It was a battery. It is a felony in this state, and it is a crime for which Mrs. Miller has already been charged by the district attorney's office. Gasps, sharp and audible, erupted around the room. Brenda's face went rigid, a mask of fury and shock. She had not expected me to bring the criminal case into her carefully controlled community forum. But I'm not here tonight to talk about the law, I said, my voice softening, shifting deliberately from the professional to the personal, a technique I had used many times to bridge a divide. I'm here to talk about why. Why would a person do something so cruel, so incomprehensible? I believe the answer to that question can be found in a small town, 200 miles from here, 30 years ago. I saw a flicker of pure animal panic in Brenda's eyes. It was a look of a creature caught in the glare of headlights. A town where a young man named Daniel Miller, a brilliant and talented artist who suffered from a severe, untreated bipolar disorder, died in a tragic house fire. I said, my voice quiet now, but carrying with a profound weight to every corner of the silent room. A fire he started accidentally, in the midst of a deep, dark, depressive episode, where he wasn't taking his medication. A young man who was your brother, Brenda. The room was utterly, completely still. The air crackled with the sudden, shocking shift in the narrative. Brenda looked as if I had physically struck her. Her carefully constructed composure was shattering piece by visible piece. You've spent 30 years running from that trauma, haven't you? I said, my voice not accusatory, but diagnostic. The calm, empathetic voice of a professional who understood the deep, complex wounds of the human psyche. You've built this world of perfect, rigid order around you to try and keep that chaos, that memory at bay. But when you look at my son, you don't see a 10-year-old boy who loves the stars. You see the ghost of your brother. You see the humming, the stimming, the unpredictable behavior that you have in your mind, blamed for the fire for 3 decades. You see the chaos you've spent your whole life trying to control. I looked directly at her, my gaze unwavering, holding her in the uncomfortable, searing light of the truth. When you turned that hose on my son, you weren't trying to restore order in the neighborhood. You were trying to wash away a ghost. You were trying to punish my child for the sins of your own past, for a grief you have never, ever allowed yourself to feel. Brenda let out a sound, a ragged, guttural sob that seemed to be torn from the very depths of her soul. It was the sound of a 30-year-old dam of denial and rage and pain finally catastrophically breaking. Her public mask crumbled into a mess of raw, unconcealed, and pitiful agony. Her supporters, the army she had so carefully assembled, stared at her, their faces a mixture of horror, pity, and a dawning, sickening understanding. The monster they had been so willing to follow, the champion of their petty grievances, had been revealed as a tragic, deeply wounded, and profoundly dangerous woman. The meeting she had so masterfully called to exorcise us from the community had become the stage for her own public and long, long overdue exorcism. The complete and public shattering of Brenda's composure at the HOA meeting was the breaking point, the moment the entire structure of her power and influence collapsed. The narrative she had so carefully crafted of a concerned, vigilant neighbor protecting her community from a dangerous nuisance, was irrevocably destroyed, replaced by the far more complex and tragic truth of a woman haunted by her past, lashing out at the world from a place of deep, unhealed trauma. Her base of support within the community, built on a foundation of shared anxieties and petty grievances, evaporated overnight. Neighbors who had been her staunch allies, who had nodded along with her vicious innuendos, now looked at her with a mixture of pity and a palpable fear, their loyalty curdling into a wary, shamefaced distance. The falling action was a cascade of inevitable legal and social consequences. The HOA facing a massive federal discrimination lawsuit from my attorneys, and a full-blown rebellion from its own residents, who were horrified to learn they had been pawns in Brenda's private psychodrama, was thrown into chaos. The two board members who had been her loyal sycophants resigned in disgrace within a week. An emergency election was held, and a new board led by my supportive and deeply capable neighbor Sarah was voted in. Their very first act was to formally and publicly issue a written apology to my family, to immediately and permanently rescind the nuisance violation and the fine, and to hire an outside consultant, at my recommendation, to review and revise all of their bylaws, to ensure full compliance with the Fair Housing Act and the ADA. Brenda's personal legal troubles were far more severe. The district attorney, now armed with my testimony, the expert witness statement from the child psychologist who had attended the meeting, and the clear, publicly witnessed evidence of her profound psychological instability and motive pursued the felony assault charge with vigor. The charge was assault on a disabled child, a crime that carried enhanced penalties. Faced with the overwhelming evidence and the complete loss of any community support for her concerned neighbor defense, Brenda accepted a plea bargain. The resolution of her case was not simple, nor was it purely punitive. It was a reflection of the complex human tragedy that had unfolded. She was sentenced to a long period of intensive court-mandated psychotherapy and 5 years of strict probation. A permanent restraining order was put in place prohibiting her from having any contact, direct or indirect, with my son or me. And as part of a significant civil settlement that averted our discrimination lawsuit against her personally, she was required to sell her house and move out of the Oakwood Terrace community within 6 months. It was a form of exile, yes, but a necessary one. It was the removal of her toxic, traumatized presence, so that both she and the community she had terrorized could finally begin the difficult process of healing. The broader resolution for the neighborhood was a slow but profound and beautiful transformation. The incident had served as a painful but necessary wake-up call, forcing residents to confront their own biases, their own fears, and their willingness to accept a bully's simple narrative over a more complex truth. The new HOA board, led by Sarah, spearheaded the change. They organized a series of community workshops on neurodiversity, mental health awareness, and bystander intervention, turning the once contentious community clubhouse into a center for education and empathy. But the most beautiful part of the resolution was for Leo. The community, no longer seeing him through Brenda's twisted lens of fear, began to see him, the real him. Children who had once been wary, who had perhaps whispered on the playground, now approached him with a genuine and open curiosity. They learned that his humming was just his way of thinking his own personal soundtrack. They learned that his love for astronomy was infectious, and that he could explain the concept of a supernova better than any science teacher. A group of neighbors led by Sarah's husband, a landscape architect, worked together to design and build a small, sensory garden in a quiet, secluded corner of the community park. It was a space designed for calm, filled with fragrant herbs like lavender and chamomile, smooth, cool river stones, wind chimes that produced low, resonant tones, and a gently bubbling water feature. Leo, who had been consulted as the lead expert on every aspect of the design, was its unofficial curator. He had a place that was not just tolerant of his needs, but was built specifically for them. Months later, on a warm, sun-drenched Saturday afternoon, I sat on a bench watching Leo in the new sensory garden. He was not alone. A small group of other neighborhood children were with him. He had his beloved astronomy book open on his lap and was pointing at a detailed picture of the Orion Nebula, explaining with a breathless, unself-conscious excitement how new stars are born from massive clouds of dust and gas. The other children were listening, their faces tilted up towards his, completely captivated. There was no fear, no judgment, no othering, only a shared sense of wonder. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was simple: from Daniel's niece. My heart skipped a beat. It was from Brenda's estranged daughter, the therapist, the one whose own trauma I had discovered during my late-night research. She had seen the local news reports about her mother's case and the events in our community. Dear Dr. Sharma. The email began the words simple and direct. I don't know how to say this, or even if I should, but I needed to say thank you. For 30 years, my mother has been a prisoner of a grief she would never acknowledge, a grief that destroyed our relationship. What you did was an act of profound courage, not just for your son, but in a strange and unexpected way for my mother as well. You forced the truth into the light. You may have given our family the first faintest glimmer of hope that a different kind of healing might one day be possible. Tears streamed down my face as I read the words, tears not of sadness, but of a deep, complicated relief. It was not a victory I had sought, but it was a resolution more complete, more human than I could have ever imagined. The cycle of trauma, a dark inheritance passed down through a generation, had finally been broken by an act of fierce, protective, and ultimately understanding love. I looked up at my son, my brilliant, resilient boy, so full of life and light, so at peace explaining the birth of distant stars to his new friends. And I knew with a certainty that was as deep and vast as the cosmos he so loved, that his universe and ours was finally truly safe.